Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. My name is Eric Gutierrez. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations. I've been at Bank Street for almost 2 years now. And again, thank you for being with us today. This is our first alumni weekend. It started off last night with our basketball awards. We had an amazing group of award recipients, really impactful and inspirational, great speeches. I hope you all be able to connect with our awardees. We'll send out more information about our alumni and the awards and what they talked about last night's event. It's a very intimate gathering today, but it's still a very important and great conversation about democracy in our schools. And before I introduce Shale, just wanted to mention after this event, we will have master classes, 4 workshops, one on the Bank Street Archives, STEAM Lab, one on emotional responsible practice, and the 4th one, family care plan in New York City. All the information you can find right outside of this room if you want to ask our colleagues for more information. And again, thank you for being here. And when it's time for Q&A, please feel free to stand up. You could take off your mask to say the question and then put your mask back on, just to be cautious. So thank you so much. And thank you, Shale, and my guest.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming. So we're a small group, so hopefully we'll be able to do some dialogue back and forth. What I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. We're lucky to have alums of the School for Children, Liberty Leeds, and the Graduate School with us today. And then we're going to have a discussion about the work that each of our panelists has involved with as it relates to this question of democracy and education. And we'll explore it from 2 angles, both what is education's relationship to democracy, especially in this moment where democracy is under attack, and so is truth and what's allowed to be taught. And then from another angle, thinking about democratic practices in the classroom. So as you go, if you have thoughts or questions, we'll have some time at the end for the audience to weigh in with your own thinking and also sort of questions that you'd like to pose to the panelists. So why don't we just go across and each of you can tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Kiara DeLello. I'm a graduate of the graduate school, the general and special education program, childhood. I currently teach 5th grade. And while I started out in my current spot as a homeroom teacher, we've been departmentalized since the pandemic. So I teach social studies to 10 and 11-year-olds.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Sharice Taylor. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Student Services and Strategic Integration for Fall River Public Schools. So I oversee everything related to student support, social emotional learning, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also mental health.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. There we go. Sorry, that's what I'm doing with undergrads. So my name is Dr. Nafis Khan. I'm just leaving Clemson, but assistant professor of social foundation, and then transitioning to work with the African Diaspora Consortium, which is a nonprofit that focuses on curriculum and student exchange across the diaspora, and the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, Slave Voyages website that I've been a part of for about 15 years. That we'll talk more about later. I'm an alum of the School for Children in 1993. Happened to be, I like to say, a legacy of 2 older brothers, 2 cousins, and a mother right here, whom I like to say she followed in our footsteps. Is one way to look at it. But no, it's a real pleasure to be back and to be on this panel with everyone. Thank you.
So Nafis, I'm going to ask you to keep going.
Okay.
We'll go back down the line and just go a little bit deeper for each person into the work you're currently doing and how it ties in your mind into this concept of democracy and education.
Absolutely. The work I do focuses more broadly most broadly on how do we talk about and learn about and teach the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade specifically, but then also more broadly about the diaspora more globally. How is it framed? Right? What sorts of questions do we ask? Do we have students engage with? How we pose those questions? And so I think this ties to democracy because in very deep ways, because an educated citizenry, if you will, is very much the foundation of a democracy in theory, right? I mean, that's the idea, is that you're guided by our interests and our knowledge of society in order to make it better, right, in theory. And so I think my work very much is informed by how we merge those ideas. How do we actually follow through on those ideas, right? How do we tell the story and retell, and which narratives do we listen to? Which stories do we hear? Which stories don't we hear? Which stories do we avoid talking about? What are the moments, the points of contention that lead to either division or further questioning? And why are they so I won't say controversial, I'm avoiding using that word because I think that has its own loaded ideas around it. So just tension, right? Just the idea that there's tension around it. Why is there a tension, right? Why is it if we talk about race or the language of race, it evokes certain reactions, or the language of identity and gender, it evokes certain reactions? And how do we prepare students to engage in that? Because they're living those experiences. These aren't, the student is not living and wrestling with their own sense of identity and experience and how they're engaging with the world. It's very much through their emotions. And so I think how we teach history and humanities more broadly very much inform the practice of engaging in these questions that we wrestle with for the rest of our lives, right? I mean, you don't stop wrestling with your identity in some way or something, like who you are, how you view the world, how you view your family, how you view your history. I think comes up time and time again, and giving students those experiences and those encounters as early as possible, really, in differing ways and meaningful ways, sometimes uncomfortable ways, I think is very much the foundation of democratic practice, right? We're talking about democracies around compromise. Well, compromise means both people are going to lose, is one way of phrasing it, right? But you have to be, there's that level of discomfort that sometimes you have to work through. And so how do we prepare students for that discomfort, right? In ways that are both constructive, but also informative, right? And sometimes challenging, right? And give moments for reflection. So I think very much, on the one hand, I like to focus on kind of the content and, the experiences of diaspora communities, but very much I'm always thinking about how do we share this? How do we engage it? How do we share it to varying audiences, in particular students, but not limited to students?
My work is very tactical and in some ways practical. So I focus a lot on how to increase family engagement and community engagement in schools and school districts that are struggling. So that could look like hosting parent workshops on how to set your child up for success. That has also looked like moving a city, Providence in particular, to be co-authors and collaborators in their district turnaround plan. My work is really focused particularly on, right now, in the last couple of years, on gateway cities in Massachusetts. So these are cities that were booming industrial centers. And when the factories closed, the economy plummeted, and almost 100 years later, over 100 years later, those economies and communities haven't recovered. So the tension that we're seeing in the communities that I work in is that those communities are now becoming increasingly diverse, particularly around students of color. So we're looking at Latinx students, we're looking at Cape Verdean students, Brazilian students, students from the African diaspora are now coming into those communities that are very entrenched in a very traditional, indoctrinal way of being American. And those communities are struggling with, what does America mean for me? And what does democracy mean for me? We ask a lot of questions around whose voice matters. I think that when we think about when cities and towns were founded, the voice that mattered were white men. And hundreds of years later, we're still asking the same question and our answer hasn't changed. So I work with schools, school districts, governments to figure out how do we get to the new answer that we need for the given community.
Nafisa did a lot of nodding along. So as an elementary teacher and a social studies teacher, I am thinking about history, but it's not specifically American history, except for, the 8-9s year does a huge unit on, the very beginnings of New York City. And that's delightful. And I can finally navigate Lower Manhattan because of that. So in my curriculum, though, especially since the pandemic, I think the critical history part has become huge for me. There's so much to debunk. My civilizations curriculum in a nutshell is Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt and a little bit of Indus Valley. And I have really enjoyed bringing kind of a critical lens to that, just in the sense of like, so by the way, all of these artifacts are stolen and looted and sitting in museums. I always tell my students where it's sitting and how it got there. They've looked at, Met Museum labels and cried out, that's sus, which if you hang out with young people, you know that they're getting it. So, what does the Epic of Gilgamesh have to do with democracy is a really fascinating question. But the other thing that has come to the fore for me is that, I'll have people, I guess it's fairly common for kids to have their ancient Egypt phase, right? Mummies and pyramids and maybe mythology as a way in. But how I do get asked, how do you get students interested in this? How do you, like ancient civilizations for 10-year-olds? And we actually start the school year now with an identity unit. You can't always vouch for, unlike a school like Bank Street, like School for Children, I'm not totally sure what they've experienced in 2nd and 3rd and 4th grade. But I sort of try to catch them up in my current setting. And so we actually do a specific project that, it's the Identity Frames project, because a picture frame is what you look through to see the world. And so they make their own frame. And I tell them what's on my frame. And I teach them all those identifiers, and they hopefully opt into as many of them as they want to. They identify racially, gender, family structure, gender expression, life stage. I identify as a kid, I identify as a tween. It's always very telling who picks which one. And I think that baseline then informs what we do and how we talk about things thousands of years ago. And I'm always shocked by that. But in pleasant ways. But any history that we're asking students to engage with, it is going to be filtered through who they are and how they identify. And so I have really become especially committed recently to foregrounding that and making sure that, when we talk about these things, we all have similar vocabulary, because that's what it's going to take for us to be together and meet each other as human beings. And I'm not preparing them for the world if I don't prepare them to speak with people across difference.
So I want to just pick up on a thread that I hear in several of the comments. As we think about teaching children about identity, as we think about teaching children the history of slavery in this country, and we think about our current political context in much of the country, there is sort of a striking and scary and different terrain for educators today than even just 2 or 3 years ago. These have always been contested topics. These have always been places where there's kind of fear about delving into the truth of our country's history and talking openly about issues of racism. But that's been weaponized in recent years as a political organizing tool in a way that it hasn't been in recent decades, though at many other points in our history it has been. And so I'm curious, for each of you, given where you sit in different levels of the education system, the different work you do, what do you make of this moment, where it's, in some places acceptable and viable to engage deeply in this work, and in other places where it's not, and in every place in some way, there are dilemmas around how to do it well. I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, one of the fascinating things I've observed in being in South Carolina for the last 7 years is there's a lot of assumptions around not just kind of the South more broadly, but of when we talk specifically, say, around the history of slavery and racism, there's, someone who grew up in New York, the idea of slavery is a Southern problem. We didn't do that up here, right? And then I think I was in 6th grade when the African burial grounds were unearthed in Lower Manhattan. And I remember many of us were like, wait, what? What do you mean there were enslaved people here in New York? And, and it was kind of as a shock. And I think many adults, not just students, were shocked by that. And one of the, assumptions around, well, in the South, they don't want to talk about it as kind of a view of it. And that's true in some contexts for sure, but it's also times the presence of that history is so front and center in many of the parts of the state. Many New Yorkers visit Charleston, right? For example, Charleston has one of the strongest historical societies where nothing changes. So the buildings look the same, right? You can't make any of those changes. But they're also very much building a new museum there, the International African American Museum, which is I think supposed to be opened up in the next year or so. And the goal of that is to look at Charleston's kind of looking outward, right? From South Carolina looking outward of the diaspora, if you will. And I think recognizing and juxtaposing that with a governor and a state legislature, which is trying to find different ways to remove any mention of race in curriculum. But at the same time, the museums are there, the communities are very much still there, kind of telling their own story. So in a lot of ways, we see the political kind of rhetoric of censorship, which is very much, part of a long tradition of, fear and trying to not tell full stories. But at the same time, there's always been, I'll say counter narratives, but I think it's also continual people expressing their own history and tying it to others in ways that we have to kind of build on and make sure we don't become too fractured in our own areas, right? So if in New York, we view it as, well, they're not doing it over there because that's a red state. So therefore nothing can be done there because it's a red state. Therefore, they can't be engaging in hard conversations. But I can tell you, they are being engaged in different ways. And I think that's part of that recognition of how are we challenging these trends that we're engaged with, right? The doubling down, the weaponizing of curriculum, right? Of the fights of standards in Texas or in Florida or Indiana or Iowa or whichever state is now, removing criticality or race or anything like that in their state standards. And so I think it's connecting and recognizing that in those communities, it's not a monolith, right? And how we support and foster those engagement across regions, are really critical, I think, to helping to recognize that we're not alone in this, right? And it's not we're the only ones who think this way. We're the only ones who want to tell the true story, right? There are many truths around. And so I think that's part of that this current context is how we support and facilitate the effort to tell the multiple truths, right? Not just replace one for another, right? The idea of reflective and encompassing and inclusive, comprehensive, exactly, ideals. And so I think that is very much that ongoing, right? Because we're not the first one to encounter, right? We're not the first generations to encounter the push for counter narratives and telling the full story for different groups of identities and communities, right? This has happened before. Curriculum has been challenged in the 30s, right? The era when Bank Street was created in the 20s, right? That the curriculum was challenged what was being done, right? So it's kind of recognizing we're not alone in this, and then building off of that and actually recognizing the current realities of what we're up against in many ways.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is right. I think that chewing on this topic for a couple of weeks, and I think that if we think about the industrial era, right, and when school was founded, it was founded to sort of teach new arrivals from Ellis Island, from across Europe and other countries, how to be American. And I think that the tension that we're seeing is a struggle to like redefine what it means to be American for communities for whom do not share that former cultural legacy. And then I think the other side of it is those who weren't taught and were indoctrinated are fighting for what they believe to be true and the way that they think that things should be. And I think that we've lost so much sight of what, everyone came to America, many people, those who voluntarily came to America, came for this idealized new future, this hope, this better economic situation. And I think that in every community, I think particularly being in Massachusetts and seeing the immigration turnover, even if you're in New York, I grew up in Crown Heights. Like that was at one point Italian, at one point it was Jewish. It's not, then it was Black, particularly Caribbean American. And then now we're seeing, a wave of millennials, right? And there's always a change. And I think that what we're feeling now is a macrocosm of all of these microcosms of change. And I think that we're sort of in this place, there's a fear, I think, to think critically, to challenge because of that indoctrination, that idea of, you're coming here and you don't want to be teased and you want to get along. I mean, bullying has been around since the beginning of time, right? But those are some of the reasons why people made the decisions to assimilate. And so now, we have young people and families who don't want to assimilate. And so I think it would behoove us to really think about who were the people 100 years ago who didn't assimilate? Who did they become? What changes the contributions did they make to society? And I think that as educators, it's on us to cultivate those young people and to inspire them and to continue to make that change. I think, when I look at the communities that I'm serving, parents are angry. They're angry, but they're angry and uninformed. And so I spend a lot of time informing parents of the rules, whether it's I want to homeschool my child because I'm not comfortable with what's being taught. If I took my kid out of school during the pandemic and I want to put them back in a year and a half later, I want to be back at the exact same school that we were at. Like the little things, like even processes, how things work. I think we've lost sight of that. I mean, Massachusetts has a whole civics education debate right now. And lack of requirements, and there have been several lawsuits. We have several lawsuits around non-binary students. And do we go against parents? If a student wants to be called by a certain pronoun or a certain name, if a parent calls and asks for information as a school district, do we go against the parent? That child's a minor. All of these things are microcosmic changes and tensions that I think if you look at the political landscape, it's just sort of a macrocosm of all the things that we're facing.
I think that resonates a lot with what's happening at a micro level within a school and a classroom. I mean, when Shale described like the topics for the panel today, I had a quotation come back into my head that I misremembered, which was I thought it was democracy is the name we give to the things we decide to do together, but it's actually more general than that. Government is the name we give to the things we decide to do together. And it gets variously attributed to one of the people who said it was at one point a Massachusetts representative. And I only learned it because of like an interesting project back in the Obama presidential campaign where it was about poetry and politics. So it was a dear moment for me and nice to remember what I had misremembered. But, when I walk into school, when I walk into my classroom, right, it's very John Dewey, but it's really just, we're doing this together, right? And we've just come through a national moment where in so many places, there's been a message of, no, we're doing this alone. You're on your own. We're literally apart. We're ideologically apart. And you're fending for yourself in terms of health, in terms of rights, in terms of laws. So many things just feel atomized at this point. And it's not been a particularly happy couple of years to be a teacher or to be a young person. Truly, to be 9 or 10 right now it's rough for them. And one of the things that has suffered the most is their basic ability to be together. Even just, you know, I watched them play a board game and I'm horrified, gently. But also this question of, anytime people come together, there's going to be contestedness. You know, you were talking about the history of the country and my ancestors who voluntarily came over and eventually accessed whiteness, but at cost, right? At a cost. And that goes back to the identity piece that, like, as a white teacher, I mean, for me to, I think I might sometimes be the first adult where, speaking to the idea of like being vocal but ignorant or vocal but uninformed. I might be the first adult teacher that a child hears name their whiteness. Nobody bursts into flame. Nobody explodes. No one melts into a puddle on the floor. Like, it is okay. And as a DEI practitioner in my school, I think that's one of the most valuable things I can teach to fellow white adults like myself. Like, no one's going to keel over. You can name it. And whatever we don't name, we're going to be responsible for. So I feel that deeply, and my commitment to that comes from my time in this building. No question about it. So I'm going to stop there before I lose my thread.
So I want to actually pick up a little bit on what you were just saying and ask each of you to think about sort of zooming into the classroom level of school, whether it's, an elementary school or a college classroom. How do you think about democratic practices in the classroom? How do you think about giving students voice and agency? And in your minds, how does that connect to some of these larger issues? And what have you seen work for yourself and for colleagues and others? Anyone can kick it off.
I'll start with this one. I think that it's really important that we give students an opportunity to solve the real problems facing their school. So I have a very concrete example. About a month ago, very recent, I received a call from a parent who was absolutely irate. That we just built a new high school, how many hundreds of millions of dollars, and there were no gender neutral bathrooms in school. Students who were non-binary or did not feel comfortable using a single-sex bathroom were told that they were to use the staff bathrooms. There was an incident in the bathrooms were not kept clean. A staff member put a sign on the bathroom door that said, if you stand when you go, if you make a mess when you stand and go, you won't be able to use this bathroom no more. But don't you worry, we'll find you another bathroom, faux show. So I'll let you all think about what are the problems with that sign, right? So the parent calls me and is irate. The student calls me herself and advocates for herself to say, I want to let you know why this hurts me. And I said, well, I'm going to say to you as a Black woman, this hurts me too. And I'm going to share with you why it hurts me. When I called the principal and the superintendent, none of them understood why that sign was offensive. And in fact, they actually defended the person who created the sign because they engaged a straight Black male student in the creation of the sign. So when I'm coaching the principal through what needed to happen, I said to him, this was a missed leadership opportunity. You did not connect with the people who are closest to the problem to find the solution. If the students who are non-binary are using that bathroom and you know who they are, you should have pulled them together and say, hey team, we got a problem. We all need to use this bathroom. We all need to have access to this because this is a measure of safety for us for our various reasons. What are we going to do to fix it? And the principal looked at me like dumbfounded. And I said, and when you engage or implicate straight Black males who have nothing to do with the problem, you cannot replace one marginalized group with another. You've now put this straight Black male student in a precarious position that had nothing to do with him. And so I say that to say, as one example of, there are real things happening in classrooms, whether you're doing project-based learning and you allow students to choose how they want to demonstrate their learning, that's a democratic practice. If you have, circle up or morning meeting, allowing students to share their identities, to share what customs they have, what is important to them. If there's a conflict, restorative circles, those are democratic practices. Being able to communicate what you're feeling and its impact on you, and to collaboratively, collectively come up with a solution, that is democracy. And we don't do that. We talk a lot about, I live in the SEL world, so I hear castle, 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 the 5 competencies 1,000 times a day. But what do we focus on? Regulation and management. We don't do any work in personal responsibility. We do very little work in social awareness. In all those things, those competencies, personal responsibility, social awareness, impact, those are the democratic practices, but we're spending more time in the oppressive practices of regulation and control. And I think that that's one of the tensions. We're very in love with the language of freedom and the concepts of freedom, but in our schools, our practices are still oppressive. And that's schizophrenia to me.
It's so real. It's, if you're bringing people together into a room, they're going to need to read each other's emotions and solve the problems that come up. I mean, democracy is when you have to explain to a child why they can't, or explore with a child why they can't do what they were doing, not because it's wrong or bad, but because of the impact it has on everyone else. And after 2 years of COVID school and COVID life, that is so far out of reach compared to a typical pre-pandemic group. I mean, I see it starkly. And the same principle applies, I mean, all the way up to I finally had a conversation with one of my pods of students the other day about gun violence, and the same principle applies. It's at what point does the thing that some people are trying to do implicate and harm everybody else without their consent and without their control? And that's leaving aside all the ideological and hate crime sides to things. That's just, about the laws and regulations. So yeah, they're nothing, when you're talking about missed leadership opportunities, sometimes for me, it's I go to sleep at night thinking about, like, that was a learning opportunity, the micro things. I mean, real life happens in classrooms. And I think that's also been brought into relief when everyone's tank is empty from pandemic teaching. How do we have, this is also it becomes a leadership question as well, is how do we keep enough in the tank for teachers to meet these moments? Because it takes effort and it takes patience that I don't always have. I'm not that perfect. And it can feel like pushing a boulder up a very steep hill. So, and yet when I hear things like that, I am reminded that this is the main thing I'm here to teach. It doesn't really matter what they remember about ancient Egypt.
Absolutely. I think one thing that I've encountered and observed in higher ed circles and in the methods classes that I was teaching, elementary, secondary social studies, and then also we had a cultural diversity class, is many of the students, and these were all future teachers, where the expectation was, you're going to provide me the content. I'm going to tell you about democratic education. You're not going to engage with it, right? Tell me what it is. Don't, and that very much, passive reception of information. And so when you had moments where they're learning, they're guiding the classroom, they're the ones trying to analyze an article on progressive ed or on new methods or identity or the language of race, they're like, wait, what's the right answer? Just, tell me, they're very capable students, but sometimes they're more comfortable with the parameters being told to them ahead of time. And if you give them the students kind of that openness, they felt for some of them, I should say, felt shaky, right? What do you want me to do? And I'm like, what do you feel when you read it? How do you react to it? What stands out to you? Kind of working through them. And this is, you know, early on in their education, because it was an undergraduate teacher ed program. So they're freshmen starting with education courses all the way to master's level students where they haven't had that experience in outside of like that one senior seminar class of 4 people where you spend all the time talking. But there was one project that my good colleague and friend had used in this cultural diversity class that I carried over in my versions of the course, was a school profile project, right? So they're doing full-time student teaching for a year, and we had them basically develop a DEI kind of profile of their school that they're placed at. And this is in the upstate of South Carolina. So if you're familiar with it, it is predominantly white, but then in certain pockets, if you will, you have a larger growing Latinx community, where in some schools there are over 50% of the student body. You have majority Black schools, you have some range, but majority white in most of the schools where they're placed. And one of the things where students, one of the elements that really kind of stuck out in them sharing about their profile, right? So not just the demographics, but what the school does, you know, what they don't do in terms of identity and issues, is how the students oftentimes assume that if there was a Black History Month program, that was like just at the very, like, that was a good thing, right? But that was it, right? Like that was the only avenue for DEI to appear, right? And sometimes then they would expect, well, it's 90%, 98% white students, why would they have a DEI program? Because it's only the presence of diversity that warrants diversity. And for students to reflect on that was part of the powerful element of like, of seeing, wait a minute, no, this is where actually it really needs to happen. Arguably more so, but you know, I don't want to say more or less, but you know, it's quite pertinent for in these in schools where no, it's not an issue. All the students they're of the same religion, they go to the same church, they're in the same, you know, economic kind of context, broadly speaking. Why would they need to talk about diversity and race? It's mostly white students. You know, like that's, you know, those are the moments to discuss it, to begin the conversation, so that when they, you know, well, as students develop, I mean, my students were all grade levels at the time, early childhood to secondary, which was another challenge. Because many, not to generalize, but many early childhood and early elementary teachers were like, wait, we don't want to talk about the race. Like they're too young. They haven't talked about it yet. And there was a hesitancy of seeing it, how it applied. But I think that the profile allowed them to raise different questions about the schools that they would be going into, right? How do you talk to the principal? Who do you talk to? And oftentimes their cooperating teacher, you know, they're kind of following what the teacher's doing. In some cases, that's really good. In other cases, the students recognize this is not what type of teacher I want to be. They shut down moments when students, you know, there was, and I'll stop after this, there was a student incident where there was a majority white school and there was one Mexican-American student in the classroom, and the students were joking about, and it was a secondary school, something around making fun of migrant workers in some way. Cooperating teacher was right there and was kind of dismissing it as, you know, these high school kids, they're stupid. Don't pay them any mind. Not asking how the student there is engaging, you know, one of the only ones in the school. And so the student, you know, I said, you know, don't in the classroom say, stop class, how do you feel, right? And kind of singling out, but have you talked to that student in general? Not asking them about the incident first, asking them how are they processing just being in the school? How do they feel comfortable? What are their friends? What do they do for fun? And then hearing how they reacted to those sorts of comments or jokes, right? It's not the first time that student has heard, right? So how do you support students without it becoming, oh, wait, we had an incident. Now we need to talk about race because we had the incident, right? You know, in a very reactive way. How can we be proactive, to be a little cheesy, but how do we fully engage students continuously in an ongoing fashion? I think it's very much part of the idea of not just democracy to bring it in, but that's how you become part of a community, is where you feel your voices are heard, or your ideas are shared, you're valued, you feel a level of trust. And so seeing how my students are then trying to engage with that in their placements is one where it's quite challenging in many ways.
Thank you. So my last question before we open it up to the audience, just thinking back to your own time here at Bank Street and the conversation we've been having today, I'm curious if there's any story or memory that sort of sticks out in your mind that you might share with us.
I got one. If one came up in conversation, then so my early on in my graduate program, for the first time reading Vygotsky, and realizing Lev Vygotsky's work, Progressive Ed, was like Bank Street Bank Street. It was like, wait a minute, I didn't realize this was on paper before. Like this is what I experienced, his idea of play and how children like develop their make-believe rules, and as you grow, they create more rules and all these things. So I got really interested in it. At Emory's library, they had an early edition of The Young Geographer by Lucy Sprague Mitchell, which I had never read while I was here, knew much about it. And in there were photographs of students making a plasticine map of their community. And immediately that came back to the 7s, 8s, or what is it called? The second grade now, right? The 7s, 8s with Beth, who I met at a conference and didn't realize I never knew her whole name. And it was Elizabeth Norfolk. And I'm like, no, it's Beth. But that's the side. But it was in that 7th grade, 7s, 8s class where we went around the neighborhood and surveyed, and bookstores were here. Pizza Town was there for those who remember, and other businesses, and then we made the plasticine version of that. And it stuck in my head of geography and the centrality of geography to our understanding of our community. And then seeing it in pictures, doing the exact same assignment, at the time, 70, 80 years earlier, was like, oh wait, this was like, it's intentional, right? It's a lesson, but you don't really realize that it was intentional, that you're making that connection. And for me, it left a real strong mark of, social studies and history, and, of my interest in kind of understanding how people interact with communities and geography very much. So the plasticine, more than 7s, 8s, it's still with me. And I still I feel like I have the plasticine on my hand.
So I know what it's like to teach students who have never had the 7s, 8s river curriculum, and it shows, and it's not good, because I'm like, if only you would learn this in 2nd grade, because I'm teaching river civilizations, and I keep having to remind them, no, that's downstream, that's upstream. But they're like, where do rivers come from? The ocean? No. And like young geographers made me sort of just like, jump in my seat. It's such an amazing text. I feel like one of the memories I have that's connected to Bank Street is it's sort of like one of those, is there a doctor on the plane moments? Because I was working as an associate teacher in Brooklyn, and we were going to do a Lower Manhattan model. And my head teacher was saying, oh yeah, they're just going to paint it tomorrow, and then it'll be fine, and we'll start building things. Like, no, we need what Maria Richa calls ushi gushi. And I said, I know exactly what to do. And I ran down to the wood shop, because fortunately the school had a wood shop, and I said, I need wood shavings. And then I went to get the Elmer's glue, and then you get a little bit of water, and you get the paint to give it color, and you mix it all together. And then you have this terrain material to actually give texture. I said, we are not doing a bad Lower Manhattan model. We are doing this the Bank Street way. And so that's, that's something that doesn't leave you. And one of the things that sucks about having 3 pods instead of 1 homeroom is that I don't have the energy to make 3 huge maps. But before the pandemic, we did a beautiful pastel map that the kids, traced and colored and added information to over the whole semester and a half, basically, marking the different civilizations. And that's definitely Bank Street style teaching that doesn't, I miss that part now.
For me, as a Liberty Leads alum, I have a lot of memories. I think they all relate to sort of facing your fears. So there was one year we went up to this residential school in Putney, Vermont. It was the mountain school, and we went rock climbing. I had never in my Brooklyn life gone rock climbing. I take the stairs places, and that was about it. And I remember I got up the mountain, okay. And everyone says, don't look down. And Sharice looked down. And I started bawling. And Kate Sussman, who is sitting up there, literally had to talk me down step by step. And then we turned it into a phenomenal college essay that got me into Smith College. Those kind of memories about facing your fears. Like that was, I think Liberty taught us how to be democratic contributors. And I think in some ways it taught us to be fearless and to be radical, you know, for the betterment of humankind. So.
Those are great stories. So now we want to open it up to your thoughts, either reflections from your own work that you started to think about listening to this discussion. We'd love to hear them, or you have questions for anyone on the panel. Yeah. Can you stand up and take, if you're comfortable, take off your mask while you're talking and just project so everyone can hear.
Yeah, I teach, I'm in special services and I teach a special ed history class at the high school level. And I've always thought of it as like smash mouth history, you know. I try not to shy away from, well, I don't shy away from the brutality, you know, I talk about Jefferson, but I show them Sally Hemings, you know, I show them the interior of Monticello. Show them the interior of Monticello, and then show them the interior of Sally Hemings. And I showed them the reunion, you know, the Jefferson reunions, and how long it took for them to acknowledge what was going on, or what had gone on. And, you know, there's the whole issue with the Jefferson Cemetery. They didn't want any of Sally Hemings' descendants in that cemetery. So I try and bring it to that kind of level. But at the same time, there's kind of a duality in our country. There is a promise that's America. And so I try and work that. I'd like to hear what you think about the balance. You know, King could not have existed in Soviet Russia. You know, King could not have existed in many places. I mean, he wasn't allowed to continue to exist here. I mean, they had to kill him. But he actually made actual change, you know, and he's just one of a million names. So I guess what I'm trying to say, what I try and explain to kids is you cannot understand the history of the United States of America without understanding the history of race. But you also cannot understand the history of the United States without understanding the open-ended, you know, possibilities of it. And I don't know if that's a good question, you know, in terms of understanding the duality in essence.
I'm going to take a stab. So thank you for that question. I think one of the challenges becomes how we set up that story, right? So oftentimes it's viewed as, now I'm getting the truth, right? So depending on the age level of the student, it's like, I never heard anything about Sally Hemings or Thomas Jefferson outside of, you know, founding father context. And then you tell me this. So now I have to rectify and this juxtaposition of great thinker and, you know, statesman type of thing, and then a brutal slave owner as well, right? And that sort of reality. And so I'm now left with a choice of, I either believe this or I hold on to this. I'm using that language kind of intentionally. And so I think part of it has to be, well, what is the context in which we're talking about this, right? Is it, you know, do we understand the institution of slavery more broadly in order to properly understand, you know, that the promise was built on that institution in many ways, right? Or, you know, they're coupled together, right? There's an entwinement. And so I think oftentimes in classrooms, when the opportunity presents itself to use the words or the experiences of, if you will, informally enslaved peoples, of what their view of that promise was, because they were very cognizant of it, right? The ones who sued for their own freedom, the ones who, you know, went after, you know, the Civil War and slavery was officially ended, who tracked down their families and wrote about it, right? And the narratives telling about the promise of what could be done, I think oftentimes will give that insight on, there's a fear that somehow talking about the brutality will make us feel worse about a nation. And all of a sudden we don't want to be Americans, or we want to turn in our passports. Like there's that kind of fear of the truth, right, if you will, or broadly the truth. And so I think making use of the language and the framing of those who led revolts, those who led insurrections, or led to create schools or for educated for free and formerly enslaved Black, tell the story of the promise, right? But oftentimes that's viewed as, if you can picture a textbook as like a little box in the end of a little extra information, but it's not the main story. I think using those as the main story to tell these main ideas of democracy, of representation, of a representative democracy, a republic, right, a democratic republic, of the idea of free, what is petitioning the government for redress is like, that's in the First Amendment, like that's a really important thing. That's how you protest, like that, to peaceably assemble. Like those are critical elements that they made use of, right? So I think talking about the First Amendment through those stories, I think are ways to recognize that it's not either you believe in Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers, or you believe the truth, and the two cannot engage and be encountered, be in tension with each other. You can engage with his writing. You can look at his writing and the complexity and the engagement and the thoughtfulness of him and the contradictoriness of his writings. I mean, in many ways. So I think that would be kind of how I would think about it that way.
I think I hear the question in the context of my students, and I'm at a predominantly white institution. And so something that actually Nafis was coming up for me in the beginning of hearing you talk about your work, there is the thread of like shame and this idea that, white people get into our feelings when we hear about this stuff and haven't learned it before. But I know that that split between like, well, this is what I knew before, and then this new information that I'm getting feels terrible, so I'm going to hold on to the old information. I think that's where my role that I would like to have as an educator comes in, as much as I can fulfill that from day to day. And that's like, I hear you. This moment you're in feels bad right now, and I don't want you to stay there. Because whether you're learning about the history of your own people, like effectively, bad stuff that was done in my name, or, bad things that happened to another group, managing those emotions can be as much an important part of the history as the history, because it's what do you want to do about it, and moving to a place of responsibility. And it's interesting, I had a boy this year who had a moment where he was feeling very ashamed in a gender-based conversation. Like, no. I literally had to say to him, no one's talking about you. No one's talking about what you've done or how you talk to girls. Like, I'm just talking about a thing that happens, and you can choose not to do it. And I don't think you want to. I don't think that's part of you. So, the same thing would apply from a racial perspective also. And African Burial Ground was part of an 8s, 9s curriculum that I did here. And there was a white child on that field trip who sobbed. I just sat with her on a bench in the exhibits, and she was inconsolable. And thinking about, I think she had a caregiver who was a woman of color. And so it just became super real for her on that trip. And like, I'm going to hold you in this moment, because what matters is what you do after this moment. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I think that this dichotomy of good and evil, right, is that has a very integral part in the foundation of education, right? And I think that we need to disrupt that paradigm, right? Everything isn't binary. Everything isn't either or. Some things, a lot of things are both and. And I think if we're going to be teaching critical thinking, critical reading, critical writing, it's the ability to be able to articulate the either or and the both and.
So I would just say with racism, I think one of the, I don't know if it's elevator, definition of racism, but the idea that it is very much tied with power and prejudice. and systems, right? That it's not just someone treating somebody poorly or somebody being mean to somebody else or somebody prejudging somebody, right? So prejudice is part of it, but it's also around power and the effect or affect of that prejudice, if you will, and that it's tied to larger systems, that these are ongoing, that it's both individual as well as societal. And I think racism, can take on different forms. Before the term race, came into vogue in the 15 or 1400s or so, there were different terms used, but that's still systematic oppression, repression, prejudice of and enacting of that power on communities, groups, be it related to ethnicity, language, color, hair texture, what have you, right? So I think that would be my, if you will, definition of racism in that way. And then just to Roots, what's interesting is Roots is a seminal of when it was aired, right? Still one of the most highly watched, worldwide, US wide, I should say. But I think one of the challenges, like as a society, is we kind of have these moments and then we forget that we've had those moments. Not people forget the information, but as a society, we kind of wait for the next moment, right? And then we don't remember that we had that moment before necessarily. So it seems like new information again, right? And it's part of this, these cyclical challenges to our narratives, which have been going on consistently since, however early on you want to go in terms of the peoples of North America, challenging what's being told about peoples in North America. And I think that's where Roots fits in with that process around, of remembering and then having to re-remember, that we either challenged these ideas before, but then we moved on and graduated, got a job, had a family, okay, now I'm coming back to it again as a society, right? Not individually, but as a society.
Good question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'll say first, I was a 7/8 teacher at VCS, so Kara, I was only there for a year, but it was a very memorable year. So it's good to see someone that teaches there also. My question is about, I newly work with undergraduates who want to become teachers of color as our target. And thankfully, in that program, we're recruiting now. We have young undergraduates that are, in their early 20s, and we have some folks that have applied that are up to their 50s. And that sort of multi-generational population exists in schools also. So I'm wondering about the friction between what you see your students would like to see a change and how they implement, how they're activists and how their families or their parents are reacting to these changes that their children want to see, but maybe the parents who may be a little older or just taught differently, how they are reacting to what is happening in their homes essentially, and then to their schools.
So I'll say from the district lens, as a district administrator, I think that a lot of districts now, we're focused on recruiting diverse candidates, right? I think the challenge in that is that cities and towns have not prepared themselves to support those teachers of color when they get there, right? And in some ways, we are passing the problem onto individuals. In the same story I told you, that straight Black male who was brought into a situation that had nothing to do with creating, we're doing that to teachers of color. The town that I'm currently working in, we're not going to do that. We're actually going to engage in some DEI work with the people who live there and are there to set conditions through which teachers of color can be successful. So I think honest conversations need to be had, because teachers of color are not gonna stay. Millennial teachers, you talk to them rough, they're out. And they know that I'm the same way, right? And they know, right, that they can get a job somewhere else. And they know that every place right now has a teacher shortage. I have schools that have been understaffed all year. My school social workers are covering classes. We have paras covering classes and bus duty and lunch duty and everything else, right? So I think that we're not having enough conversations with the institutions that we're sending students to. And the cities and towns own some of that responsibility to set the conditions for them to be successful. Otherwise, you're continuing to deflect the problem. My district right now, this summer, they're going to do a book study on nice racism by Robin DiAngelo, which specifically speaks to that. You know, New York is a very large city, but in these towns that have anywhere from 40 to 90,000 people, there's a lot of stuck old ways of engaging. And, you know, there are those who think that, oh, well, we have new people coming in and they'll change things. That's actually not what happens, right? What happens is those young people, they go through that education system, they suffer, and they say, I'm gonna go find people that look like me, and I'm going to college away and I'm not gonna return. So I don't know that, you know, hiring diverse candidates in itself is going to change the problem. There actually needs to be some adaptive work with those who live there. You know, change is lost. People don't fear the actual change. They fear what they're going to lose or what they think they're going to lose. And that's what we need to address.
I'll just quickly echo that here in Massachusetts and South Carolina, which, you know, if you value or don't value the state rankings, you know, on the opposite end of the rankings, very much engaging in the same issue of teacher shortage. That's the rhetoric for the last 10 years. All the years I've been in South Carolina, it's teacher shortage. And the conversation about recruiting. And so recruiting teachers of color, but retention of teachers of color is not the conversation, right? Or retaining and supporting in rural context, and not rural equals white and urban equals black. That's not South Carolina's context. Many rural schools are black schools, right? And so that conversation is different, but it's still the need to recognize and support the community's engagement with how do we support and encourage teachers to stay, right? Stay in the rural context. And the state does, you know, there's the, you know, either subsidizing or supporting them financially, and that's not working either, right? It doesn't have the long-term, because teachers aren't going to teaching for money. That's not, you don't go with, so it's not going to be the incentive that oftentimes I think some states and some differing groups think that it will be, right? Supporting financially is different than the incentive, the financial incentive model. And so I think to retain teachers, there needs to be a conducive environment, not a necessarily high testing environment, which is the only ranking we seem to use, but it can be in a majority white school and it'd be a teacher of color if the community is engaged in reflective practices, or if it's a school that is really struggling. But the students, they want it, they're demanding it, but it's a struggling school. It has issues of violence and poverty coupled, compounding in those communities. But many of the teachers, and new teachers as well, some of my students they felt a connection to it. They felt part of the conversation. And it was important because of the leadership of a particular principal who supported and fostered that, almost counter to, wait, but this is one of the most struggling districts in the state, but it's one where the teachers don't leave, right? And so that means that there's a level of continuity. Now, can they improve their practice? Of course, right? But there's a level of continuity and support that was fostered by leadership. And I think that's where that nexus needs to happen of, you know, not just bringing teachers young, you know, oh, we need recent graduates, undergrads, we need the youth, right? The energy. That energy is going to go somewhere else if it's not feeling supported in many ways, right?
I think we forget people don't stay in places where they don't belong. If I don't feel like I belong here, why on earth would I stay? Right? And I think that when I think about the towns in Massachusetts, there's always been a culture of staying.
Yeah.
And when our teachers of color leave, there's always this like dumbstruck look of, well, where did they go? No, really, I've had administrators say, but and say to the staff of color, but if you leave, where would you go? And I tell them, anywhere. Do you know how many kids in America can't read or need a good teacher? Anywhere. You know, and I think that like, that's why I think studying the conditions is so important before you bring in teachers of color, right? And I think, and that's the hard adaptive work, because it means that I have to reflect on myself. I constantly have to reflect on myself as a Black administrator. How am I colluding in the cause of harm? If I'm administering a suspension hearing, I have to think about, and they're appealing a placement, I have to think about, why am I co-signing on this principal's decision? And if I don't co-sign on it, how do I create a plan that actually is in the best interest of that student? And like, those are the conversations that we need to get right and get on the same page about before we bring anybody new into the mess.
So I think we have time for one more person to ask a question. If anyone has something they'd like to say or share. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So that was a piece that I wanted, I mean, first of all of this is so true, right? Like, I hate when people talk about like teacher pipeline problems. Like, if you put canaries into a coal mine and all the canaries die, and then you just say, oh, we need more canaries, you don't have a canary problem. That's not it. And that's borrowed from a book, an anecdote in a book about women in tech, you know, like it applies to all your identifiers. It applies to many different identifiers, and it's crazy making. It can just make you distrust reality. Like, who is making these decisions, right? Who thought this was a good idea? From the teacher perspective, that's often how I'll find myself feeling, like you wanted this person to stay. But I in your question, I also picked up on the parent piece, and you know, what happens when what's being taught in the classroom doesn't align with parents' visions or what they think their values are. And I just want to make it not so scary. And I think School for Children, I don't know if they're still calling it this, I hope it hasn't changed this much, but the racial justice and advocacy curriculum is all grades at a specific time of day, at a specific set of weeks of the year. And there's something so beautiful about that, because this, like, it's such a commitment. Everyone's aligned. And the piece that I feel like I have talked about in so many other contexts until I'm blue in the face is the part where parents come in for a curriculum night about that racial justice and advocacy curriculum. And they come in and they sit on this stage, at least the years that I was here, and they go through some lessons and experiences that are exactly what their children will go through. And it takes the fear out of it. And I think that's particularly for white parents, like, you know, say that out loud. You know, sit through a practice affinity group that is not racial. It's based on like, oh, are you an only child? Are you a twin? Are you an older sibling, a middle, a youngest? They understand. They sit in the same affinity groups that their kids will learn to be in, and they realize why an affinity group is awesome. You know, there is so much fear and shame bound up in these topics, and I think so many people underestimate the power of bringing parents along preemptively. And also making it mission aligned and saying, you know, this is part of what we believe in as a school. So here's why we're doing it. And I'm the same way with my students. You know, I may not always give you a choice about what's about to happen, but you always have the right to ask me why. And if I can't give you a good rationale, that's on me. I need to figure that out.
Last thoughts or comments? Sure.
I haven't heard anything about the relationship with nonprofit organizations outside of the schools and the value that they hold for teachers and other educators. And I'm just stating this because I think of Liberty and what Liberty did for students who came here. There were many students who came who would never have said they were bright in their particular schools, especially the schools that we were associated with at the time. students they couldn't say they were bright or that they wanted to learn more, that they wanted to be more intellectual. But when they came to Bank Street created a safe space for those students to come. And the students all of a sudden were with other students who wanted to feel brilliant, to feel bright, and they could do that in Bank Street because Bank Street created that space. And this is about the Liberty Partnerships Program, which has existed here for over maybe close to 30 years now. But the important role it provided, and I'm just saying this because teachers, when things look bleak, especially in the schools today, think about the nonprofits who are out there providing supplemental education to students. They can go to these places which provide safe spaces, and they do learn a lot. And these programs are now very sophisticated in terms of looking at developmental levels of students when they come in, and therefore what kinds of activities they should be involved with. And I just want to leave that with you all to look around you and to see where you have nonprofit programs. I am currently associated with a number of them. But one of them is HEAF, in addition to Liberty, is the Harlem Education Activities Fund, which provides enormous activities for kids who are in the public schools, essentially, and really prepare them from 6th grade onward to college. And they don't leave them when they go to college. They stay with them to make sure that they get all the support they need in college as well. And when they leave college, they hook them up with mentors who are working in industry. And so that's another avenue for all educators to think about, the nonprofits that are serving children and adolescents. Thank you.
Fern, that is the one thing I miss about working in New York. The plethora of nonprofits. When you go to these smaller cities and towns, they don't exist. If the nonprofits in Fall River are primarily focused on substance abuse prevention, or they're social service agencies focused on housing, or it doesn't exist, or you'll have a program that will take the top 5%, and that'll be 20 students, and that's it. But I have a district of 10,000. So what happens to everybody else?
Well, Cherise, your goal is to find
So when I leave school districts, I'll start a nonprofit, absolutely.
That's my challenge.
Accepted.
Well, I wanna close here, but I'd like to just note what a rich and interesting conversation this was, and I'm proud that I'm able to join each of you on this panel and all of you here today in the audience, because I think it represents the sort of array of different work that Bank Street does, and more importantly, the power of what happens after people leave Bank Street and move out into their professional careers and do amazing things. And so thank you all for sharing your work with us and your thoughts with us. And thanks to you for spending the afternoon with us here in the audience. Have a great day.